Part 3. Whatever Thing Death Be. Chapter 19. Hello, Benoni. Rachel Coyote stood at the door of the den on a small plateau. She lifted her head. She drew a smile around her narrow snout, and she listened. Rachel could hear with her heart. With her heart she heard her husband skitter across the plains above, and with her heart she heard him sneak into the forest. Ah, Farik. He might be quiet as a cloud upon his paws, but his nerves made a crackling static, and his fears fairly shrieked. Daily he went to the forest now, and though he never told her why, she understood the secrecy. He was protecting her from the world. Dear, dear Farik. One day he would laugh. Dainty Rachel, red coyote, she lowered her head and stepped into the south-running stream. Purposefully, she waded down the canyon, turning where the canyon turned. She had her daily secret, too. A dry shelf ran along the water to her left. If she were fussy, she could walk it, but she was near term now, and rather liked to float her swollen belly in the water, cooling the sensitized nipples. Icicles hung from the sheer canyon walls on either side of her. The water that leached down through the rock and had frozen drip by drip. These icicles grinned like rows of teeth, fangs. Elsewhere they drooped like tightly grizzled beards. Farther down the gorge they stood columnar, from the foot to the rim of the cliff. Ice, ice from the world above. Well, it was winter. No one expected respite from winter in this northern climate. The days were little and cold and gray, but Rachel didn't complain because here was a blessing, a canyon stream that kept forever the same temperature, breathing steam into the wintry atmosphere. Rachel proceeded through a cathedral grandeur, ice pillars rising on the left and on the right of her. Her step made slow by the kindly water, which sometimes she paused to lap. Holy clouds surrounded her. Soon she fell into a contemplative mood. She held her head all to one side and smiled and seemed a sacred thing. The babies were moving. This was one reason for her secrecy these days, and for her regular walks away from Farik. The babies moved often now, and often with surprising pain. In Farik's presence she bore the trouble silently, since any hurt in her distressed the poor coyote past sense. There was no good in Farik's knowing that infants trouble the womb. On the other hand, Rachel had a thrilling need to declare that pain, to consider as best as she could, to feel, to know every last detail of this exquisite experience, this carrying life, this bearing of babies. Such knowing meant dropping into sudden silences without a husband's asking why, or weeping without that husband's falling into a panic. Moreover, such knowing sometimes urged sweet Rachel truly to cry out, to give voice to the pain, to hear it in her own ears, straightway to laugh and say, "That's it, I understand." How could Farik handle that kind of behavior? Or how could he ever comprehend that Rachel took pleasure in the hurt itself, and that these tears were dear to her? Or this, the wonderful thing now dawning on the woman, that suffering is a holy work, and graceful indeed. Let Farik protect her, dashing bravely through the dangerous world. In her own way she protected him from knowledge too wonderful for minds of the matters of fact. Even so did she love her husband and her children at once, though the loves were different one from the other. The babies were moving, and they were very big. Ah! But how can one keep secret forever her marvelous revelations? Finally, she needs to tell them, doesn't she? To share them, explain them in the ears of another? To validate them, for heaven's sake, to hear one other soul agree, "That's it, I understand it too," and then to smile together because it is so good. It is so valuable. It makes a life worthwhile. Well, that was the second reason for Rachel's regular trip downstream. Such a someone awaited her at the deep end of the canyon. A plain brown bird with an extraordinary length of bill and damaged wings had accepted Rachel's friendship and had given friendship in return. Unto this bird she told her revelations. And what did the bird do then? She hopped to the coat of the coyote. She picked parasites from the roots of the fur and rubbed oils to the surface and glossed it. By strong claws she combed the coat of the woman. She groomed dear Rachel unto a shining beauty. She did this patiently and well, who was herself no pretty thing. But this was the way that she talked. This is how she said of motherhood, I understand it, and it is very good. For she had no tongue in her head, and all her words besides were jug jug and taroo. She did communicate, that plain brown bird, both eloquently and selflessly, and Rachel tingled all over her flesh with the message. They had become fast friends, two women bound together, each by a wound in her body, though one's was peculiar to her, and one's was the genius of her gender. Suffering may be, aye, suffering could possibly be, a holy work and graceful. So the babies were moving. So the mother floated down to her companion this day too, to take the benediction of a friendly presence. And so it was that she barked a raw bark while gazing at the plain brown bird. The bird was still in her bush, still perched in that wiry tangle that hid Worm's portal, the flue that went down to the netherworld, the hole that blew one everlasting note as through an organ pipe. The bird had just lifted a crippled wing in greeting when Rachel surprised herself with a bark she had not expected. She woofed. Her eyes looked fleetingly shocked. Then suddenly she hunched her spine, threw up her head, and howled, long and painfully. What Farik hadn't told Rachel was that the white wolf Boreas roamed the forest, and what Farik was doing, daily, was watching the wolf. He had no notion ever to fight Boreas, huge at the shoulder. His notion, in fact, had been to flee. Oh, he'd have surrendered 100 square miles at a pinch, and gladly, if Rachel had not found her home. But she had, and he loved her, so his alternatives were reduced to one, a canny, nerve-wracking observation of the enemy. It was some small advantage to know and not to be known. But it took all the courage that a poor skulking coyote could muster just to approach the wolf and to watch him. Boreas moved with a slope-shouldered power, his nose near the ground, his white eyes shifting, his muscles taut to the hip, his paw so monstrous that 4 of Farik's could collect into a single print. Boreas moved in casual possession of the whole world round, whereas Farik was the alien anywhere he was. Boreas slung his tail low, contempt. Farik stiffened his tail straight out behind him, tense. Boreas ambled. Farik Coyote darted thither and yon, ever to keep down wind of the wolf and up country if he could. This is what one knew and the other did not know. But he who didn't care, and he who did died with perpetual fright. So went the vigil, until this particular day, when Farik's anxieties doubled with a new discovery. Oh, it was a miserable advantage after all to know and not to be known. Farik saw his wolf in the dead center of a clearing, while he himself lay low between roots. The wolf stood still, listening, twisting his ears in various directions. He was a stark white creature, unhurried and majestic. Slowly he lifted his massive head and woofed twice tightening his stomach. He listened again, and then both of them heard a snarling answer, a smug, malevolent voice. The white wolf waited. The coyote shrank between his roots. First in black flashes amid the pine, and then whole from his nose to his tail, a second wolf appeared. coal-black, a blood-red eye, lesser in size than Boreas, but longer in the tooth, and the teeth were yellow. This one presented himself in the clearing before Boreas and grinned. "Notos," growled the white wolf, and they met. The wolves were gathering. Farik's mind spun with the implications. Expect a pack. When food was scarce, wolves drew into packs. This stingy winter encased every edible thing in ice so that no one could scratch a decent meal, except a pack. And then whose den would they be seeking, and whose wife was too fat to run, and who couldn't fight to save her anyway? Oh yes, expect a marauding pack! The white wolf and the black one met, and Farik saw nothing but a gruesome future in front of him. And a pack! His loins contracted. He nearly urinated. And then it was not his ears but his heart that heard a horror. "What, Rachel? What?" he cried silently. "Why are you howling?" The world was too full of trouble. "Wait!" he cried in his soul. "I will be with you!" And Farik, like a twitching shadow, was gone from the forest. Down the stones flew Farik, hardly touching them. At bottom he cut left, scrambling the turn, and he dived into the den. Rachel was there. Oh yes, the woman had been howling. Oh yes, poor Rachel was in pain. Farik fixed an instant in the doorway, his mouth both open and wordless. She lay on her side, her 4 legs thrust out as stiff as death, her toes splayed, her fur soiled from writhing around the floor, her fur damp, her lungs pumping, all of her teeth laid bare and grinding, her eyes compressed. This was Rachel, the woman of contentments. What? This was his gentle wife twisted on the floor. How? "Rachel!" he barked, as hoarse as a bullfrog. "Rachel!" At the sound of his own voice he took to dancing, did Farik, nervously from foot to foot. And Rachel herself? At the sound of Farik's voice she expelled a long stream of sour breath. She relaxed her legs and allowed her eyes to open. They rolled until they found him, and then she smiled, and then she began to laugh, gentle laughter, like a little brook down pebbles, a gurgling really, a happy succession of chuckles, but laughter nonetheless, over which she closed her eyes again. Farik was angry. "Tssst," he said as some sort of warning. He felt compelled to make a warning. This wasn't right. Rachel only laughed more helplessly. He said, "You're laughing!" It was an accusation. She nodded. He spoke the truth. He said, But you're hurting, Rachel!" She nodded. "Well," squeaked Farik, suffering for her, furious with her both at once. "Well, no! You shouldn't be laughing when you hurt. You can't laugh. Against the rules." But she could. She did. Until warm tears washed her eyelids, Rachel laughed. Farik nearly exploded. "What's the matter?" he pleaded of her. She shook her head. There was a sigh and a lull in her laughing, but no words. Into her more sober attitude, Farik spoke a sincere opinion. "Rachel," he said, "I think you have gone crazy." To which she opened her mouth. Farik expected a yowl out of it, but a little sting broke in her breast. A little string broke in her breast, and a brighter, more wonderful laughter than ever poured out. Then Farik was beside himself, stomping the ground with both forepaws together. "Stop it! Stop it!" the poor coyote wailed, so confused. I think," he decided, He tried to explain this conundrum. "I think that you are laughing at me, Rachel." Well, he really did finally think that, since he surely didn't understand her condition. But she seemed to, and therefore he was the dummy. That was the cry that arrested the woman. She fell into an honest silence. She gazed at Farik from lying sideways on the ground. All of her, every limb of her, went limp with weariness. She whispered, "Farik, I'm happy, and I love you, so I share my happiness with you. You called my name, and there you were, and all my happiness ran out to meet you, Farik. That's how my happiness comes out. I laugh." "Oh!" said Farik. Fool. She wasn't crazy now, no, he was just a fool. But because she must be right, but he still didn't understand. "Rachel?" he whispered. "What?" As soft as ashes. "You stink, Rachel, like sickness." She nodded, and he was empowered to go on. "You're a mess, and I smell blood in here, and I can feel you're hurting, Rachel, all the way down my back, and I can hear you're hurting, Rachel, and all of the air around us, like ticking, like terrible time, but you say you're happy, and I believe you, but I just don't understand. How can you be happy? What's the matter?" Farik was trying to be so reasonable. Rachel looked at him with a nearly unutterable love. "Nothing at all is the matter," she whispered. "I'm having the babies now." Farik's ears shot up, his brow and his eyelids and his lip all lifted. "Which is hard work and hurtful work, but some of the happiest work in the world, see?" He shook his head. He nodded, expressionless, his snout a cucumber. Babies. His heart began to bang all over in his chest. Babies. He said, "That's fine, Rachel." Formal Farik Coyote. She smiled. "It truly is," she said. "Now, don't feel bad, Farik, and please don't think that I don't like you," she whispered. "But you should go away now. I'll do what I have to do alone. You'd feel worse to stay here." He nodded total agreement with her assessment, but he stayed put, staring down at her. Babies. Rachel's breath came more rapidly now. Her great belly began to heave, but she kept her voice a gentle whisper. "Farik, go, please. Run to the end of the canyon. That's something you can do for me. Tell my friend my happiness. Go, now, please." He nodded. He didn't move. "Babies!" Suddenly Rachel sucked a tremendous lot of air, snapped her jaw shut on it, ground her teeth, and began to force the air out again through a tight, exquisite pain. Her tail hooked up behind her. Her body doubled around, focusing all its strength upon the vortex deep within her abdomen. But Farik was gone on the first point of that scream, as though it had jabbed him in the rear. Zoom! Coyote blur between the canyon walls. Earnest Coyote, desperate to do some job. He ran with inspiring skill the narrow ledge that banked the stream, his nose straight forward, his tail straight back, leaning into the turns but never missing a footfall. Gone, gone, good Farik Coyote. As he closed on the southern end of the canyon, where the walls widened into a gloomy yard, nervous thrashings began in a bush there. A bird. Long bill, broken wings. Rachel's friend. Okay, he aimed himself toward that bush and that bird. His coming seemed to madden the bird. She switched the air with her bill, crying, "Jug!" A negative. Farik slowed his step. "Jug, jug!" she chattered at him. He didn't understand. He was a most confused coyote. But his run took him straight to that bush, so to that bush he went. And though the brown bird leaped down to his withers, from which she stabbed him in the back of the skull, causing stars of bright pain, and though she yanked backward on his ears as if to rein him to a stop, that coyote roared to her at the top of his lungs, "Rachel is very happy right now!" And, "She told me to tell you that!" Farik lay before a wiry bush, with a bird on top of his head, waiting. At the right time, he was going to go back to Rachel. For the moment, he simply could not sort the crowd that had populated his brains. Wolves prowling the winter and the territory near their den. Boreas of perfect power, Notos of a side-winding malice, the white eyes and the red together. and this was only today that he'd glimpsed the gathering. And Rachel tells him that she's doing a good and happy thing, but stinks exactly like battle guts and running blood, and he's a fool, she's smiling. And when he goes to give good news to a friend, she tries to peck his little intellect to death, then suddenly settles down to nest between his ears. All is forgiven. What is forgiven? What did he do? Wolves, potential attack. Rachel, attacked, but happily, but even now he felt her writhing. This bird, presently picking parasites from his ear holes, did attack, but she was the only one named as a friend. Poor Farik, so small in the universe, so skinny and incapable, confused almost to tears, surrounded by countless dangers, and having babies. Having babies seemed to blow his little scrap of life into 1,000 fragments. Having babies seemed a terrifying multiplication. Farik wasn't sure how he'd survive the crisis. And why was a bird on his head? The bird, for her part, was trying with all her might to apologize. She truly, truly wanted to guard the hole to hell and protect any other living creature from the ruinous evil that had engulfed her there. When this bullet of a coyote came racing toward her, therefore she could think of nothing but stopping him by any means. So she rode him like a mount and punctured his skull cap and almost drilled him to the brain, which for her would have been unendurable. To sin the same sin twice? She had forgotten, as the obsessed most often do forget, that one's obsession isn't everyone's. This coyote didn't even know of the dire portal behind her. He had other reasons for coming, kindly ones despite his furious aspect. When he bellowed greetings from her friend then, she was overwhelmed by her error, and she fell to wiping all the little hurts from off his head. She dearly wished that she had a tongue to explain, but she hadn't. Oh, like a maiden auntie, then, she fussed all over his scalp, stroking, picking, combing, scratching, curling his hairs and killing his fleas. And he lay down and allowed it, and she took that for a sign of forgiveness and was glad. She did. She nested between his ears and finally counted this a glorious day because she had 2 friends. In its own good time it came to an end. Gloom rose early in the canyon bottoms, and the evening cold came down like fog. Only a strip of sullen sky could be seen above, and those below quickly became ghosts to one another. The coyote sat up. The bird took her leave, hopping again to her habitual bush. "Jug," she said. "I think so," said the coyote, and he said, "Goodbye." And she, "Teru." Oh, it was a rare gift to have 2 friends. She watched the skinny, bemused coyote creep nervously to his destiny. She wanted to comfort him, saying, "It's a good thing, having babies," but she had no tongue. Farik lifted his paw and scratched the stone outside their den. There was motion inside, and a very weak voice said, "Come in, Farik." He swallowed, and he went in. Rachel, barely visible, Rachel nickered at his entrance in. She was lying on her side, so holy that he drew back, guilty of dust and sin and all the foolery he had performed before. Did he have the right to be here? But quick-eyed Rachel, seeing him grow slack, said, "Farik, sit." He sat. All was still. What a consecrated room their den had become. He put his forepaws together and was uncomfortable. Rachel chuckled. He saw the white teeth flash, and then she nudged a damp bunch of something in his direction, using her snout like a spoon. She was so tired. The thing said, "Please." She whispered, "Benoni." And Farik, squinting downward, said, "Oh," without the least idea of what a Benoni was. "This is your son, Farik," she whispered. "Oh?" he said. A sort of panting began at his stomach, traveling upward. "Your son," she said, "Benoni, the oldest coyote." Then the knowledge flooded him. his throat and his mind together. "No, but this is your son." Farik wailed, "Oh!" He stared at the wriggling lump, absolutely struck dumb to be presented with such a thing as a Benoni. The thing said, "Pwee!" and Farik Coyote burst into tears. "Well, Benoni, you have a face and a snarling little snout in it, and tiny legs with tiny paws, and pads and nails and all. Oh, Benoni, Benoni." Farik lowered his head and licked the critter with an instant, ineffable love, blubbering all the while exactly like the fool he wasn't going to be again. Rachel laughed in a tired, pure delight. One after the other she pushed daughters toward him. Twill was the name of one, and of the other Hopsacking. He licked them, all three, tasting Rachel, but gazing steadfastly at the wonders underneath his chin. "How do you make life, Rachel? How do you do that?" It was a holy room, a holy night, a remarkable woman beside him. Hoarsely he whispered, "Can they think, do you suppose?" Rachel chuckled at the question. "But they're a helpless mess of pottage, Rachel, and there are wolves." He bit his lip. He felt the frigid world behind, saw babies before, felt suddenly weak between, and choked. I mean, he said. "Farik, who do they have for a teacher?" said Rachel. Well, there was a problem. "And have you forgotten," she whispered, "how much God loves the little? Besides," she stretched herself out, revealing her belly, "these pups of yours are very shrewd." She made a clicking sound in her mouth, and then it was that Rachel was granted her dearest wish, that Farik Coyote should laugh. For as soon as she clicked, the puppies scuttled toward her. Now, it had taken Farik the better portion of his life to figure out what nipples were for, but these three knew instantly. They popped those things into their mouths and settled to sucking with loud smacks and flips of their tails. Farik's ears shot up. Oh, Caddy!" he roared. At the end of this tumultuous day, the father plain lost his reserve. He switched from tears to laughter at the perfect instincts of his children. He laughed. He laughed while Rachel sighed, and he bellowed, "Caddy, Caddy, Coyotes 3!" because who had smarter pups than he? With wonderful speed, Benoni and Twill and Hopsacking grew. They sprouted a bright red hair flecked with rust. They developed pugnacious snouts and little teeth, milk-white and needle-sharp. They fought and tumbled and teased and giggled and chained the heart of their father, and they ate. Weaned, they were brought to the bird in her bush, who blessed them with a jug-jug and then teru. But weaned, they needed a heavier food, and Farik wasn't finding it, and that worried him more than he could say. It was a snowless winter, a dreary, ungenerous winter. The ice denied him even the bark of the trees, so that he dulled his teeth trying to strip it. But he was a father now, and the children trusted him. Him! How could he be worthy of that trust if his daily trips grew miserable, his foraging more and more futile? He himself could cease to eat, to be sure, but not the children. No, not the children, or else what kind of father would he be? Chapter 20. Jarius Cub. "Two things I can do," said Chanticleer. "I can crow the crows, I can feed Chalcedony. I'll do those." Pertinax Cobb, the ground squirrel, hadn't minded when hens and some mice and a certain weasel of immoderate length had collected at the hemlock tree across the Liverbrook, and chicks of a noxious peep. He stood erect at the porch of his own tunnels and watched the bustle, and he didn't mind. Neither did Pertinax mind frightfully when it became evident that they meant to stay in the neighborhood, troubling the morning with a babble of clucks, and he stood erect to watch them, busifying the day by perpetual peckings at the ground, scratchings, wanderings abroad, and he scrambled down his side of the stream and stood up to watch them, disturbing the early night with gossip. So sure was he of his not minding, in fact, that he freely, nay, fearlessly, put the question to his wife. Pertinax ran down his tunnels to the master chamber, where another ground squirrel like himself was weaving matting for the winter. "Mrs Cobb," said Pertinax, keeping his voice as innocent as a baby's. "Mrs Cobb, you decide. Am I complaining?" "No, Mr Cobb, you're not complaining," said Mrs Cobb. "Right," he said, and straightway he ran to resume his position, perfectly upright at his porch, confident now that he was indeed not minding, and putting a rather more severe twitch, therefore, to his whiskers. Pertinax Cobb hadn't minded the golden rooster either, nor the metronomic regularity of his crowing, because the bird was beautiful, of a beautiful song, and Cobb fancied himself something of an artist. Besides, he valued schedules and self-discipline. He hadn't minded the jolting crow in the early mornings. He hadn't minded the midnight broodings, which necessitated that the ground squirrel pop up in the moonlight, erect to watch. He hadn't minded, though this cost him much patience not to mind it, that the rooster never once took a neighborly glance across the street in neighborly fashion to greet the neighbor standing there, waiting. What Pertinax Cobb did mind, however, was that at the cold beginning of the winter, when he had expected some relief, since animals generally retired into a winter's seclusion, allowing other animals their peace, the whole community began to act as if it were the spring. Boisterous noise, furious activity, a royal racing about, a totally untimely scavenging for food. Craziness. The neighborhood was in an uproar, and Pertinax was displeased. "Mrs Cobb, what are they doing over there?" "I'm sure I don't know, Mr Cobb." "They're piling food. They're digging bins and storing food." "Do you think they're hungry?" "Why," cried Cobb, "they're not eating a bite of it." Up to the surface he shot. Closely he watched the hennish rushing, scrutinizing every move, chattering the idiocy of their contretemps. And down he went again. "Nope, not a bite," he declared. "Well then," said Mrs Cobb, "they mustn't be hungry." "Do you hear that?" said Cobb, cocking an ear. "Do you hear him? He's the one, you know. He gulled them poor chickens into delusion. Why, it makes a body nervous to be living so close to such nonsense. Him and his crowing. Mrs Cobb, tell me straight, do I have the right to complain?" "Well, it ain't natural," she said. "And who can sleep?" he said. "Mr Cobb, you've every right to complain," she said. "Right," he said, and he took himself straight to the top of his burrow, where he complained in a mighty and chittering pet. But nobody noticed, saving Mrs Cobb, who loved him. "Chalcedony!" crowed that golden lord of the hemlock, quite pointlessly to Cobb's way of thinking. "Chalcedony will never go wanting again!" But then an extraordinary thing happened in the environment, followed by a more extraordinary thing in Pertinax's nature, and the ground squirrel wasn't the same thereafter. The Liverbrook froze solid, removing a natural barrier between the neighbors. Upon finding that there was a hard path between the rooster and himself, Cobb ceased chattering and grew intensely silent, wondering whether he'd made a nuisance of himself before, and was he remembered. "Mrs Cobb," he whispered, "I didn't complain too much, did I?" "No, Mr Cobb," she said. "You're the soul of discretion." "Well, but did I complain at all?" "No more than was righteous, Mr Cobb." "Some?" he asked in fear. "None," she said with finality. "Right." That night he did not stand up on his porch, little Pertinax. He sat in a wad of fur meant to be innocuous, one tiny eye peeping over his own butt, still to watch, being a squirrel of insatiable curiosities, but now as a lump, a tussock, a natural piece of terrain. The rooster, to his horror, did cross the bridge, too stealthy in the darkness to allow a squirrel's escape, and stood 3 yards from him. Then the breathless Pertinax listened. First, he heard the breathings of the large bird. Next, he heard the song of the midnight broodings. As soft as always, the rooster sang, but this time Pertinax could understand the words. He listened with less belligerent ears. He listened in humility, being suddenly unprotected and feeling very small. He listened when the rooster thought no one heard, so the soul was in his song. He listened, and this is what happened. Pertinax's cob was moved. It was an eerie flute the rooster produced. "Often I open my heart and speak my cares," sang the rooster, "but there is none to hear them. When I name my memories, they rise before me like visions. My friends are there, but when I reach to touch the ones I love, they fade away, and one by one they pass into darkness, and I am left alone. Why shouldn't I be full of woe?" Strange, Pertinax felt the night to be peopled, animals coming and going on the strength of the rooster's melody. Even stranger, Pertinax felt sad. "Why shouldn't I weep for the world?" the song went on so gently, but by some spell it didn't seem the rooster's voice any more. In the black night another soul intruded, a mournful roll of music, a solitary wanderer with no community at all. Who lives as long as he should, or if he does live long, who isn't haunted by the memories of those he lost? Death, death suffered either way. Alas for the pins, the children of my lady. Alas for the widow, the mother of 7, and for the orphans she left behind. Pertinax knew nothing of these names, but they were real. They came of a grievous history ghosting the night, and he mourned them, knowing they were dead. The voice of the singer darkened. He almost thought a great mammal lay beside him. "Alas for my lord," the song went on. "Where is he now, when I yearn for some word for him? Oh, that he would smile once more! If only he would come and curse me once more, one more time. Come love me with his scoldings." The voice faltered. The ground squirrel had altogether forgotten himself. He listened. Deeply, hoarsely, the lamentations swelled. "Oh, that he would crow, one crow for me in the sunlight! But he is gone from me, and who can find me in the darkness? Who can call me from the netherworld? Not one! No one can come near me any more. Pertinax gasped at the sorrow in that word. And then a mystery, a drama occurred in the pitch-black night, for it seemed that 2 voices arose in dialogue, each an impossible distance from the other, but both of the same source, and both calling out of the painful incompletion of their love. "Marooned! Have you forgotten me?" "Forget you? How could I forget you, oh my heart?" "Marooned! Rest! Please rest, perturbed spirit! Don't mourn so hopelessly. Marooned! Can't stand it any more! When will you come to take me home? When God gives me the strength and the wisdom, Mundukari, when the mighty God will finally speak to me again. Oh, Mundukari, oh!" Then silence, an interminable silence. "Do you believe me?" But silence. It was that silence and the terrible desire of the rooster left unanswered that wrung poor Pertinax, and he made a noise. He sobbed. Immediately the silence changed. It was merely the frozen night again. The rooster took a quiet step in the squirrel's direction, so that he was suddenly, keenly aware of himself, and he swallowed his sobbing. But the rooster said, "Hello." "Oh boy, discovered. Look out now, rooster blows are next." But the rooster said, "You look sickly, little fellow. You shouldn't be sickly. No one should be. You would do me a great kindness," said the rooster, as gentle as fleece and sincere, "if you'd come take some food with us tomorrow." Mrs Cobb, said Pertinax Cobb, wake up. What? Oh, said Mrs Cobb, did you sleep well? It's the night, he said. Go back to sleep. Thank you, I will, she said. Mrs Cobb, said Pertinax, that rooster is a saint. A blessed, generous, sensitive saint. Do you think so? She said. Mrs Cobb, I do. Well then, he is a saint indeed, she said.